All right. Hello, everyone. We're just letting everyone filter in. We'll get started in a moment. Okay, so while everyone's filtering in, I would like to welcome everyone and thank you for joining us tonight over Zoom and over Facebook Live. For those of you that are watching over Zoom, I'll just point out a couple quick features of Zoom webinar. If this is your first time in a webinar for Zoom, you won't be on camera and we won't see your video and you will be muted. So, but we still would love you to participate through the Q&A. It's a button down at the bottom of your screen. If you shake your mouse, you'll see Q&A and also chat down there. So please do put in any questions and I will read them to Mr. Craig Gralley at the end of our program. So that's the Zoom webinar feature. And I'm very excited to introduce author Craig Gralley tonight. He is a former senior intelligence officer with the Central Intelligence Agency and has broad experience across the agency's directorates. Among other assignments, Craig was chief speechwriter for CIA directors William Webster, Robert Gates, and James Woolsey, and he served as an analyst and manager with CIA's Analysis Directorate, the National Intelligence Council, and CIA's Office of the Inspector General. He's now a freelance writer and has published work in a wide variety of news and public affairs magazines. Craig is the author of Hall of Mirrors, Virginia Hall, America's Greatest Spy of World War II, and this book is a Kirkus Review's Best Book of 2020. The book has also received accolades from the Historical Novel Society, Independent Book Review, Spyscape, and from senior members of the intelligence community, including former CIA Director, General David Petraeus. You can learn more about Craig and his work on his website, www.craiggralley.com. I'll also be adding a link in the chat where you can purchase a signed copy of the book, Hall of Mirrors. And now I'll turn it over to Craig.
Thank you very much, Erin. And I'd also like to thank Gloria Corcoran and everybody at the Wilmington Memorial Library and all of you for inviting me to speak today about Virginia Hall, who I am calling America's Greatest Spy of World War II. Erin, you want to put on the first slide, please?
Absolutely.
Okay. This, of course, is an important week in an important year. Of course, it's the centennial year for the 19th Amendment, giving women, allowing them to achieve the right to vote. It's also the day after Veterans Day. So these two events really remind us that heroic women also built this country. Very, very important. And women heroes are finally getting their due. And Virginia Hall, of course, was one of these heroic women that we'll be talking about today. I thought I'd do three things today. I thought I'd speak a little bit about how I came to write the book about Virginia Hall, tell a little bit about Virginia's life and career in espionage. And then if there's time, I'll mention how my wife and I discovered the trail that Virginia Hall took through the Pyrenees in the winter of 1942. This, of course, was the trail she used to escape the Gestapo and Klaus Barbie, who was then known as the Butcher of Lyon. Then we'll open it up for questions. Erin mentioned a little bit about my background at CIA. I think everyone who thinks that anyone who worked for CIA must have been a spy. And of course, I had worked with people who were spies. I worked with people in a variety of the different kinds of directorates. But as she mentioned, I was mostly an analyst and a manager and chief speechwriter for 3 directors of the CIA. But I have had work experience in virtually all of the directorates. So I have a good understanding of espionage. I've traveled extensively, including to war zones in Iraq and Afghanistan, also in the jungles of Colombia. I've seen our young officers, men and women, in action. our agents working overseas in hostile territories. I retired in 2013. I became a consultant and worked at the CIA history staff. And that's where I came into contact with Virginia's file. At the same time, I went back to school getting my master's degree in writing from Johns Hopkins, and I needed a thesis topic. And Virginia's file came back to me. I was thinking, you know, what a dynamic woman. And wouldn't it be great to write a story about Virginia Hall? Well, I talked to my thesis advisors. They had never heard of Virginia Hall before. And after I wrote my thesis, they were very, very excited. They said, you've got to continue and write a book. So that's, in fact, what I did. Next slide, please. Recently, it seems like the public has discovered Virginia Hall too, and her popularity continues to skyrocket. I started my book about 6 years ago, but midway through my research, I found out that there were 2 other books that were currently being written while I was writing mine. One was A Woman of No Importance by Sonia Cornell. You might be familiar with that book. I worked with Sonia on her book a little bit and helped her with CIA documents. Don Mitchell wrote a young adult book called The Lady is a Spy. And actually, each one of these books is quite different. A Woman of No Importance, of course, is a biography of Virginia Hall. The Lady is a Spy is a young adult book. And mine is though it's based on hundreds of historical documents that I have from CIA as well as from the British archives. It is written in Virginia Hall's voice, so it is a first-person novel about Virginia Hall. There are currently 2 movies in development. Actually, one was just released called The Spy, starring Sarah Megan Thomas. And in fact, that's in movie theaters right now, and it's also streaming on Amazon Prime. I just participated in a California film festival with Sarah, and the movie has been getting pretty good reviews as well. The second movie is based on Sonia Purnell's book, A Woman of No Importance, and that stars Daisy Ridley of Star Wars fame, and that is supposed to be released next year, probably mid-year. So it seems like Virginia Hall's story is coming alive. Still, Virginia as a true spy would have been appalled by all of this because true spies really like to live in the shadows, and they really don't like to have a lot of publicity surrounding them. Why don't you have the next slide, Aaron? Okay, so who was Virginia Hall? This is a picture of Boxhorn Farm where Virginia Hall grew up. By all accounts, she had a very happy childhood, but she belonged to a family of risk takers. Apparently, her grandfather was an Irishman who, at age 9, stowed away on a clipper ship bound for Baltimore and rose to be chairman of the Baltimore Gas and Electric Company. Her father was a real estate entrepreneur who owned movie theaters. So Virginia had an entrepreneurial kind of background family, and it kind of rubbed off on her. But she did grow up with a charmed life. And this, of course, is the Boxhorn Farm, which is on 110 acres of 110 acre estate. She took her summers in Europe with her family. It seemed like her whole family was willing to accept risk. And this kind of independent lifestyle rubbed off certainly on Virginia. Next slide, please. This is a picture of Virginia's yearbook. Growing up, Virginia attended the exclusive Roland Park School for girls. It's no longer for girls, but it was at that point it was. She was a good but not a great student, but she had a passion to lead. She was class president, editor of the school yearbook, captain of the field hockey team. So she enjoyed taking leadership positions. The thing that really caught my attention, though, was that she loved to act in school plays. She found a certain kind of freedom in being hidden. I think that was a good training for the life of espionage. Lorna Catling, who was Virginia Hall's niece, said Virginia always liked to play the role of the pirate chief. So again, it gets into this feeling of that she liked to take leadership positions and liked to have roles that were in senior positions. Her yearbook also called her the most original. She had a streak of boldness, independence, and self-confidence. There's a story that circulated that one day she wore a snake around her wrist as a bracelet and took it into class. So that's the kind of person that Virginia Hall was. But she was also a very rebellious person. She refused to take required courses at Barnard and Radcliffe and dropped out. Now, one of these courses actually was gym class. Maybe some of these people, maybe some of you can kind of identify with that, but it's kind of surprising that Virginia was refusing to take classes. So one of the characteristics of Virginia was, in fact, that Lorna Catlin told me that Virginia was considered to be a little bit scary. But after leaving Barnard and Radcliffe, Virginia decided to travel Europe. So she took classes in Grenoble and Paris, and she finally graduated at the Consular Academy in Vienna, Austria. Virginia's ambition was never to be a spy. In the 1930s, she was a clerk in the State Department. She was very ambitious. Her goal was to be ambassador. And a lot of her friends would have told her that that was a silly, impossible dream, because in the 1930s, there were only 2,000, of the 2,000 people in the Foreign Service, only 6 were women, and there were no women ambassadors. But undeterred, she wanted to take the Foreign Service examination. Next slide, please. But in December 1933, a disaster struck. When Virginia was bird hunting on the Geddes Delta in Turkey, she climbed over a barbed wire fence, her gun discharged, and she shot herself in the foot. Gangrene set in, and the left leg below the knee was amputated, and she was fit with a wooden appendage very similar to this. Now, the 1930s prostheses were crude. They were carved blocks of wood, little articulation. It weighed like an anchor. It was 7 pounds. So it was mostly for positioning, and somebody could be able to put their foot down and gain some balance that way. She went back to Boxhorn Farm to recuperate, but to add insult to injury, Virginia was barred from taking the Foreign Service examination because State Department at that point had some discriminatory rules against people with amputations. If you had an amputation, you couldn't join the Foreign Service. She fought it hard. She enlisted friends in high places. You know, having the society background that she did, she was even able to have her family petition President Roosevelt. Well, President Roosevelt wrote Secretary of State Cordell Hull, but Hull refused. So Virginia was disgusted. She quit the State Department and began to travel Europe. And that's really kind of where her real education started. She lived in France. She learned 5 languages: French, German, Italian, Russian, Spanish. She began to understand the culture and the history of the region. But in the late 1930s, this was a time of tremendous turmoil in Europe. It was Hitler's rise to power. So when the Nazis invaded France in June of 1940, Virginia was driving an ambulance for the French military. And when Paris fell, Virginia fled Paris and went to Ground Zero, which at that point was London, where the Battle of Britain was taking place. Next slide, please. It was in London that Virginia caught the attention of the British intelligence service, the Special Operations Executive. They were looking for people to do and live in France and other countries, willing to take dangerous assignments and to live among the enemy and to report back. And Virginia became a prime recruit. Let's face it, she was a risk taker. She was very much of an individualist. She knew the languages of the region. She knew the languages of all of the enemies for the most part. She had an understanding of the customs and the knowledge. She was independent and fearless. So she was very attractive as a candidate. But what really attracted the Brits to Virginia was the fact that she had a US passport. At that time, the United States was not in the war. The United States was a neutral. So the US passport allowed Virginia to travel freely throughout France. And she had a helpful cover too. She had a cover job as being a journalist for the New York Post. And that allowed her to ask probing questions of military and political leaders. And she was able to report all of this back to her British spy masters back in the Special Operations Executive. So Virginia was actually accepted to be the first female agent to live behind the lines in Vichy, France. Next slide, please. This took enormous courage because she was operating solo, living with the enemy. She had no backup. Before she went, she really didn't have too much training. She went fairly early in the war. And while she was there were a few equipment drops. But what she did have was discipline, an understanding of the target, the language, and the customs that allowed her to move with ease throughout the country. Her first mission was called Geologist 5. The Brits wanted her only to use her eyes and ears, and it was only supposed to be a 3-month mission. But she went far beyond her charter, and she stayed for 15. She organized resistance groups, she coordinated jailbreaks, she planned sabotage operations, and she reported all of this intel back to the British. Those who live in the espionage world know that the longer that you stay in country and the more spies that you bring under your wing, the more likely that you're going to be discovered. And Virginia was discovered and betrayed. Her name was given to this man, Klaus Barbie, who was known as the Butcher of Lyon, who was responsible for the deaths of 25,000 French men, women, and children. And he was hunting Virginia actively. And it's reported, and he is reported to have said, I would give anything to get my hands on that limping bitch. It's harsh, but it's true. Next slide, please. So Virginia had to get out of France. She wanted to depart by boat via Marseille, but that became impossible because at this time it was November of 1942. The Allies had just invaded North Africa and the Nazis were retreating to France and the unoccupied zone. The unoccupied zone was becoming occupied. Germany now had a free hand to begin rooting out Allied spies, so that the Mediterranean and Marseille was now swarming with German patrol craft. So the only exit for Virginia was over the Pyrenees to freedom in Spain. She had 2 hours notice and left Lyon for the Pyrenees at 11 p.m. on November 8th. It was just in time because her agents began to be rounded up the next morning by the Gestapo. So as Klaus Barbie closed in, again, the only avenue of escape was the snow-capped Pyrenees in the winter of 1942. It took her 3 days and the terrain covered 50 miles. And of course, she has a prosthetic leg, so she had to drag it through the snow. And it was quite a heroic effort. She arrived in Spain on the 12th of November, which just happens to be today, 78 years ago. But that wasn't the end of her ordeal. She was arrested at the train station by the Spanish police for illegal border crossing. And she was thrown into jail for 6 weeks. The Americans and the Brits finally had to realize that she was in jail and picked her up. Most of us at this point would have said, you know, I've had enough. I'm not going back, but Virginia demanded to return to France. The Brits said, no way. Klaus Barbie is after you. There are posters all around France. There's a bounty on your head. And one of the cardinal rules of espionage is that agents don't go back or can't go back to the country where they were burned. But Virginia was extremely determined. And she went this time to the new American spy organization, the Office of Strategic Services, OSS, led by Wild Bill Donovan, and requested that she serve in the OSS. And Donovan was in a bind because D-Day was fast approaching and he only had 3 agents in France at the time. So having Virginia with all of this experience was a real plus for him. So he readily agreed that Virginia could, in fact, join the OSS and be reinserted back into France. The next slide, please. Virginia, to make herself even more valuable, taught herself Morse code. And she returned to France as a wireless operator. Now, this was she returned on the eve of the D-Day invasion. And at that point, she helped to organize and equip the Maquis. She led 1,000 resistance fighters to blow up bridges, communications networks, fuel depots, all of which helped to prevent reinforcements from reaching the Normandy beaches after the invasion. And in doing so, she helped to ensure the success of the D-Day invasion. Next slide. At war's end, Virginia received some of the highest accolades that the Allies could bestow. She was awarded the MBE, member of the British Empire by the Brits. She was recommended and was awarded the Croix de Guerre by the French. She received the Distinguished Service Cross by the Americans, basically the only civilian woman so honored in World War II. But true to form, she refused all public ceremonies, even the medal ceremony hosted by President Truman, because she feared it would blow her cover and she wanted to continue serving as a clandestine officer. Next slide, please. I think that's the next one after this. Yeah, that's it. Great. Virginia got her chance to resume her career in espionage when she joined the CIA in 1951. Virginia was the first female clandestine officer in the operations directorate. And her job there was basically to work against newly installed communist governments in Europe and Latin America, planning political and psychological operations. She was a trailblazer, but working at the CIA really wasn't too much of a happy time for her. She was behind a desk, the world was changing, the hot war had turned cold, and it required a different kind of skill set that Virginia had a hard time adjusting to. The way that operations officers in CIA get promoted for the most part is also by willingly going overseas and spending entire careers overseas. Virginia did a few extended, what we call TDYs, of tour of duties, which are short periods of short trips overseas for the most part, but she largely stayed back at Langley. And it seems a little bit odd that the characteristics that made her so invisible and so successful in wartime, her gender and disability, which made her invisible for the most part, also worked against her in peacetime. In the 1950s, there was institutionalized discrimination at CIA. For example, women's ops officers could only rise to the level of GS-14, whereas men could rise to 17 and above. So the agency, to a certain extent, squandered her talents. They didn't know what to do with her for the most part. What they really should have done with Virginia, and she had so much experience and so much talent, was that they should have put her in charge of ops training, but they didn't do that. Next slide, please. So Virginia retired in 1966 at age 60. In 1957, she married an OSS officer, Paul Goyot, who was parachuted into the Haute-Loire region where Virginia was stationed. But that was near the end of the war. And after they were married, they moved to a 40-acre farm in Barnesville, Maryland, where they had a large garden and raised French poodles. Virginia died in 1982 at the age of 76. Erin, that kind of concludes my presentation. I'd be glad to take any questions or talk about, the trail that I discovered with my wife back in a few years ago if you'd like. But I'd be willing to take questions now if you'd like that too.
Sure. If our audience could start to submit some questions in the Q&A down at the bottom there. And in the meantime, would you mind telling us about discovering
Sure.
her Freedom Trail?
Yeah, it's kind of, in order to write a convincing book, I figured that I really had to understand kind of the defining event in Virginia's life. And for Virginia, that was her trek across the Pyrenees. It's what she called, it's the hardest thing that I would ever do. That's what she told her niece, Lorna Catling. There was only one problem. No one knew where the trail was. So in May of 2017, and then again in September of last year, my wife and I went to the Pyrenees, and we in fact discovered Virginia Hall's Trail. In May of 17, we arrived in France with only one paragraph from a book written decades ago that talked about Virginia Hall's Trail. It was by an early biographer, a man named Vincent Nozel, and the paragraph was in French, which I don't speak, but fortunately my wife does. So it offered a few clues for us that were helpful in our search. Our first stop was in St. Jerome's, a museum there that is dedicated to World War II freedom trails. It's the only museum of its kind in France. It's really just kind of a one room museum that has a lot of glass cases with maps and blue and red lines going all over the place. But we talked to them about Virginia and Nozel's books. They had never heard of Virginia. They had never heard of Nozel, and they knew of no freedom trail in the area where we were looking. So basically what we had to do was go directly to Villefranche-de-Conflent, which was the location where Nozel said that the trail began. So, I mean, it was just kind of a hunting expedition at that point. So we went to the information center. I mean, basically that's where you go when you don't know where you're going. And we talked to some of the people there. And again, my wife speaks French, which was very helpful. And we laid out the story, and we got a lot of shoulder shrugs and a lot of, pained expressions on their faces. But one woman behind the counter was intrigued, and she talked to some of her friends behind the counter, and then she made a couple of telephone calls. And after about 10 minutes of this kind of back and forth behind the scenes activity, she mentioned, yes, there is a trail. It's on the edge of town, but be careful. The trail is really steep. So at that point, we got a little bit excited. You want to put the river picture on, if you can, Erin? We have some pictures here of the trail that I took while we were, yeah, we'll start with that one. Yeah, we went over rivers. We passed a few towns. We were getting discouraged. And then we became excited when we, in fact, visited a town called Py, and in the middle of the town, there was a glass enclosed map that actually showed a trail, a small trail, leading from France into Spain. And it hit a number of the markers that Nozel had kind of alluded to in his paragraph. And at that point, we knew we had found the trail, and we were so delighted about that. This is the Alagamine River. This is one of the rivers that Virginia had to cross on her way through the Pyrenees from from France to Spain. Erin, if there are a couple of other pictures too, I can, if you have them. This is an overall picture that I was showing before. You see, this is taken at the top of Col de Mentet, which is a mountain. This is a mountain that Virginia had to climb up and then climb down, but we're looking from France into Spain. And at the bottom right corner, you can see a very little trail. The bottom right it's in the green patch. That's right, right in there. That's the trail. And that's the trail that leads up into the mountains that are the border of France and Spain. Now, this was during the trip of 2017, where we took the French side of the trail. In last year, in September, we took the trail from Spain into France. So, Erin, I think there are a couple of other pictures that we can show. Okay, this is This is part of the trail from France into Spain, leading to Mantet. You can see that little ribbon. That is, in fact, the trail that Virginia took. I can only imagine. It might not look steep, but it's very steep, and I can only imagine too. Wearing a prosthetic leg in the wintertime through snow, dragging a prosthetic leg 50 miles for 3 days through rugged terrain. Next slide, Erin, please. I think there's one more. Yeah, this in fact is the trail leading down from the mountains towards the train station. Well, actually, there are probably about 20 more miles to go after this. But this gives you another kind of example over the kind of terrain that she had to traverse, which was just tremendous. Do you have the movie now? We could show that. The movie is actually taken from the top of the border. It's a mountain where the border between Spain and France. This is the mountain pass, and pretty soon we'll show the actual trail. There we go. Now we're looking. Okay, if you stop it right there, and that'd be great. Very good. We're looking from Spain into France, and up on the left, upper left-hand corner, there is a little trail you can see that just kind of zigzags back and forth down to the town of Mantet, and then it looks like it's a flat, but it's right through the valley between these mountains right here. I can assure you, it's not flat. It goes straight up. And through the valley, there's another trail that Virginia took. If you want to continue the movie, Erin, that'd be great. And this gives you a feel for the kind of terrain that Virginia had to traverse in order to flee the Gestapo in the winter of 1942. It's barren. She had to go down into that valley from the mountaintop where she was. And of course, now it's turned into a little bit of a ski resort off to the side. But it tells you that they get a lot of snow up there. And Virginia faced quite an ordeal and quite a number of obstacles in order to make the trip. So that gives you a little bit of idea of the kind of stamina, the kind of fortitude that Virginia had to have in order to escape. And that, again, was the ordeal that she called the hardest thing I'd ever do. So I'm a marathon runner, and I tell you, I was huffing and puffing walking the trail. So I can only imagine what it was like for a woman with a prosthetic leg to be dragging it through the snow up and down the mountains, 3 days and 50 miles. So it's a tremendous feat.
Yes, quite the trek. Yeah. One thing that I had read, and I think that you had touched upon earlier, is that part of Virginia's success really did come down to her being a woman. My understanding is that Germans at the time would not have suspected a woman of being capable of that kind of spycraft until she was uncovered. Is that?
That's true. That's true. But also the fact that she had a disability, that was both an advantage and a disadvantage. Well, advantage, but it was also believed that a woman with a disability would fly under the radar for a little while. But of course, after people were saying that, you know, this disabled woman is doing all of these things and you know, is doing sabotage operations and everything else, that became a tell. So they were looking for the limping lady. So it really was a little bit of an advantage to begin with, but later on, no, not so much. There were a lot of women who, in fact, were took very dangerous roles as being wireless operators. That seemed to be, you know, and there was a little bit of, well, not a little bit, but a lot of discrimination against women. They were never really given leadership roles. The McKee really didn't care for women very much because it was not believed that women could lead in those kinds of situations. So it was, for the most part, women were given roles like wireless operators, which were very dangerous positions, and also couriers were kind of like the assigned positions for women as well. But during the war, the Brits really needed, you know, people forget, like early on in the war, they really had their backs up against the wall, and there were thoughts that the Brits would lose the war even before the United States entered. So they were looking for anybody that had skills and abilities that they'd be able to put to use. But yes, you're correct, Aaron, that women early on were not were selected because they thought they could fly under the radar a little bit more.
Excellent. And as you'd mentioned, I had not before this year heard of Virginia Hall and her story. Well, she's such a fascinating figure. You know, with the 3 books and 2 movies, including your own book, Hall of Mirrors. Why do you think her story is garnering like such attention now? Is there an anniversary of something, or something that's come to light?
The situation is that Virginia didn't draw attention to herself while she was alive. She wrote no memoir, she gave no interviews, she spoke very little about her life overseas and the world of espionage, even to her closest friends and relatives. So Virginia was what they call an old school spy, where she signed a secrecy agreement and abided by it. So while other people were, you know, were flaunting kind of like the rules and writing books and everything, Virginia never really wanted to draw attention to herself. Part of it too was because she wanted to have a continuing career in espionage. And if she drew attention to herself, she couldn't go undercover anymore, especially if she wanted to work for CIA. So that would blow her cover. So part of it was that Virginia really didn't want to draw attention to herself. But part of it too, for why it's coming out right now, I think that women's stories are coming to the fore because it's an important time, because of you know, these anniversaries about you know, the 19th Amendment and so forth. And I think it's, you know, a high time that these interesting stories are finally coming to light. You know, there are other stories that are coming out, not just about Virginia Hall. There's one called Agent Sonia that's written by Ben McIntyre. In fact, I'm writing a review for World War II magazine for them on that one too. Now that was a question of, or a story about a Russian spy who was a German Jew who in fact was a believer in communism and ultimately you know, was the handler for Klaus Fuchs. Who handed over, you know, secrets that sped the development of the Soviet nuclear weapon. So, I mean, these stories are starting to come out right now. I think part of it's a sign of the times. I think people are interested in women's issues and women's stories now a lot more than they were before. And again, one of the things too is that in the past, a lot of the history books were written by, let's face it, men, and women were shortchanged in that respect. But there are a lot of heroic stories that are finally coming to light, and I'm certainly delighted about it.
Yes, certainly. It's wonderful to have a more diverse and inclusive look at some of our history. It is high time. For your own writing, what drew you to Virginia Hall specifically? I know somewhat your background, I'm sure, had a hand in it, your background at the CNA. And what drew you to write about her in a novel rather than maybe a biography or nonfiction?
Sure. I wanted to write about her. Well, what drew me to her was that Virginia Hall is an icon at the agency, but they pay lip service to her without really knowing the depth of her experience or her exploits. I mean, what they'll do is they'll trot her out during Women's History Month or Disability Awareness Month and write a little blurb about her. But I wanted to dig deeper into her life. I felt that after I started working on her story and I saw her file again at the history staff where I was working kind of on a consultant basis, I thought that it would be again a good thesis topic, but I also felt that I could add more interest to the story if I didn't do a straight biography. I'd traveled to war zones, so I'd seen our women agents in action, and they're smart, tough, and confident, the kind of people that I wanted and I assumed Virginia Hall to be. I'd over the decades I had learned about espionage, so I knew about brush passes and dead drops and all the other kinds of spy tradecraft that could add additional interest to the story. And of course, I had unique access to Virginia Hall's file being on the history staff. I interviewed CIA officers, like a CIA psychiatrist, which was a very interesting interview, who was specialized in trauma and had been part of Operation Iraqi Freedom. So he was able to tell me about what it's like to have a prosthetic limb and the kinds of things that go through your mind. So, and finally, I used kind of like the discovery of the trail to get more of a feeling and an understanding of what Virginia went through. And instead of just doing a straight biography, I thought I could go deeper into the character of Virginia, using kind of my knowledge and experience and bringing it together to show a personal story of Virginia. Now, again, I've done all the archival work in the British archives and our archives and CIA archives, but I wanted to bring it together and with my knowledge and experience and have a story that has depth to it and a richness to it as well. So that's why I wrote it as a first person instead of a biography.
Excellent. And was this your first? I know that you have quite the experience as a speechwriter. Was this your first fiction attempt or first book-length writing?
Well, working at CIA, I was doing a lot of in-depth, extensive writing. Of course, none of it was fiction, but what I wanted to do with the Virginia Hall story again is to add a richness of depth and quality to it. So it was, in fact, my first effort at doing a historical fiction, I've since given copies to colleagues at CIA. One of my friends bought 5 copies, and he's in the espionage business, and he's passing them out to all of his friends as Christmas gifts. So it was kind of gratifying. And then when David Petraeus, former CIA director, read it and gave me a rave review, that was delightful too. And I'm certainly appreciative of the Kirkus, the upcoming best books of 2020 list too. So I think it's been very successful, and it's kind of whet my appetite for doing more.
Excellent. We have a question in the chat asking if you can elaborate more on Virginia Hall's work in the Cold War after World War II.
Well, there are some things that are easily declassified. Part of what I did was in declassification work when I went to the history staff was to actually declassify a lot of what actually was my own writing, which was kind of interesting because having a 34-year career, you kind of cycle through. But while all of the OSS documents had been declassified on Virginia Hall, her specific work in some of the political and psychological operations work in Eastern Europe against communist governments hasn't been declassified yet. So that's another story that needs to be told. There's a declassification process that keeps on working through. Again, I don't believe that she was very happy with what she was doing because it was not in the field. Quite frankly, her marriage was not to Paul, was going a little bit sour. But that is basically what she did, political psychological operations against newly installed governments of Eastern Europe. And that's basically what I can say.
You can tell us.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
And I understand that some of the photographs we were able to share tonight were given to you by Virginia Hall's niece.
That's correct. Lorna Catling. Lorna is the keeper of the flame. She's now in her mid-80s, and virtually everybody who is writing a book about Virginia Hall has to talk to Lorna Catling because basically she's the last person who knew Virginia. I had spoken to a couple of people at the agency at CIA who had some fleeting work with Virginia Hall, but weren't able to provide me with as much information about Virginia Hall the person as Lorna Catling. And Lorna lives in Maryland. She's a very, very wonderful woman who is the keeper of the flame.
Wonderful. And I know I had mentioned that there are a couple movies, one very recently released streaming called To Spy. And I understand that you did some consulting or work with the... Yeah,
I did some consulting work. I just kind of lent my talent and experiences as a CIA person who had reviewed all of the materials. I'd worked with Sarah Megan Thomas, who plays the role of Virginia Hall. I've spoken to her about Virginia Hall the person, how she acted, how she limped, things like that. Then they wanted to know a little bit more about some of the research that I'd done on Virginia Hall. I thought that Sarah Megan Thomas, who acts, has produced, and was involved in the screenwriting of the movie. She did all three things. She did a very fine job. Her research was pretty good. It was what she called inspired by the story of Virginia Hall and Nora Khan and Vera Atkins, which gave her a lot of license in order to bring all of these characters together into a cohesive story. But since that time also, last night I participated in a California Film Festival. Of course, all this stuff is Zoom, with Sarah Thomas, and talked about A Call to Spy as well as Virginia Hall too. So who knows, maybe there's going to be continuing work. We also do some social media stuff together and so forth. She's a wonderful actress, and I enjoyed the film very much.
Yes, it sounds like quite the intriguing film about a few very interesting, legendary figures, really.
Absolutely, yes.
All right, if anyone has questions, they can enter into the Q&A. And one question I have, Craig, is, are there any other historical figures that you'd like to write about next?
Actually, I'm working on one right now. I can't really talk a lot about it because I'm still collecting the data, but it's a Polish spy, Cold War, who worked for CIA in place for 3 years in Poland, who gave up a variety of different kinds of agents throughout Europe. And then, very strangely, perhaps because the agency had kind of tossed him aside, they use these people a little bit, at least they used to pretty extensively, and then kind of like give them a little stipend on the side and kind of push them on their own and say, okay, kind of go do your own thing someplace else. He claimed to be a descendant of the Romanovs. So it's really kind of an interesting story. I'm working on it right now. I'm getting information from the Polish archives. I hope it all comes together. This is going to be totally nonfiction though. So I'm switching genres, but hopefully I'll still be able to go deep into the personalities and provide a little bit more information about the nature of espionage.
Excellent, something to keep an eye out for next. And I am posting in the chat signed copies of Craig's book, Hall of Mirrors. Can be purchased through his website. I'm posting the link there. And then Craig, you also run a blog about Virginia Hall.
That's right, I do. That's right. I run a blog on Virginia Hall. It's basically the only blog on about Virginia Hall anywhere. And it's at www.craiggralley.com, CraigGralley. And it has a lot of interesting stories, has more photos. It has, next week, I'm going to be doing a review of Call to Spy. So it has a following, it has quite a following. And it's also, I think, pretty interesting for people to come back to kind of multiple times if you're interested in who I'm calling America's greatest spy of World War II.
Excellent. I've linked that there in the chat, and I will also make sure to link that and where Craig's books can be purchased in our follow-up email that you guys will be receiving after this event. All right. Well, thank you so much, Craig, for joining us and for telling us about such a fascinating figure. Really appreciate having
Well, thank you very much, Erin. I enjoyed speaking with you. I know these Zoom things are a little bit strange, and hopefully at some point in the future we'll be able to actually talk in person. But I'm glad that living in the mountains of North Carolina, that I'm able to have a chat with people in Wilmington, Massachusetts.
Yes, it's been wonderful to. Geography is of little matter these days.
Exactly. Well, I enjoyed this opportunity, Erin. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, everyone. Have a good night.